Hi, and welcome live to Copenhagen, here from the programmer's office at the Rito Moto headquarters. I'm Rito Cristiano, and today I will be talking about the new recon vehicles that you have seen in the recent update. Let me just check that we do have sounds. Do we have sounds? I'm getting a note that the sound is too high, so I'll just have one. Is this better? Right, let me try that again. So I want to talk a bit about the new recon vehicles that we got in the game in the recent update. As you may have seen it, it is the T8E1, the BA11, and the Puma. The Puma has been requested for quite a long time, and I'm quite happy that we've got it in the game now. So the way we figure out how something goes in the game is that we first need to look at the role we need in the game, and in this instance it was we need some more vehicles for the recons. We already had some added in the past update, which is part of this entire idea that we needed more recon vehicles. But as I said, we are looking at what roles do we need in the game. We needed recon vehicles, so then the second part is to find out which vehicles would fit in the game. And here I turn to the reference forum, which is one of the sub-forums we have on our main forum, where people who are interested in history can sign up and help out with finding research and all other sort of things that are very helpful to us. So I started a thread saying that we needed some recon vehicles. I already had some vague idea what to add, and my initial layout was something like this, where we have some new German vehicles. We definitely knew that we wanted the Puma because it is a very sought after vehicle. Everyone loves it, but I wasn't too sure about what to add for the US. I'm quite keen on the M3 A1 Scout car myself, but that would be something of a tier 1, and that is something we don't have an immediate plan of putting it in the game, but it's still sort of on the table. I had no good ideas of what to add for the higher tiers of US vehicles. There are some on the table that would be potential, but none were really that good. For my initial thought for the Soviet faction was that we could have a BA-27 because I couldn't really find anything else. Then thanks to the responses from the reference forum, I got some new suggestions, and I came up with this layout, which is a bit more like what we see now. I had a lot of requests for the T18E1 Boarhound. The problem with this vehicle is that although it is a US-produced vehicle, it was never used by the US. It was produced for the British, but never really saw service with the US Armed Force, which we could go for that in a stretch, but I would prefer something a bit more home to the US. Then we got the suggestions for BA11, which is the one I went with, especially after reading a bit more up on the vehicle. And it was an absolutely perfect match for the game. I should also mention that I will be taking questions later on from the Twitch chat. So have your questions, and Rito Bobot will note them down, and I'll answer them later on. I also have some questions from Discord, which I will also be answering. Anyways, after a bit more chat back and forth, someone else suggested a layout like this with the T8E1 Stuart as a potential recon vehicle, and that was a very interesting idea to me. That you have a tank, you remove the turret, and you have a fairly decent recon vehicle. And it would be quite unique compared to all the other vehicles, even though it doesn't have a huge cannon. So I explored that idea a bit more, and the more I looked into it, the more I was sold on the idea. So that is what I essentially went with, and it also had the bonus that I could update our old M5 Stuart model, because this is based on a Stuart light tank, so I could get two birds with one stone by making this vehicle and simultaneously update one of our very old assets that could use an update. Anyways, that is how we decide what vehicles to put in the game. And many thanks to the forum for helping me out with this. The next step in getting the vehicle from an idea into an actual vehicle in the game is that I make what is called a design mesh, where I sketch out the entire vehicle in a block form. I have all the proportions right, I have all the bits and the pieces, the wheels, the tracks, everything is set up so it works, but it's very, very blocked out. And I'll just open an example of it, if I can find my window. There we go. Here's what a blocked out design mesh for the Puma looks like. So as you can see, it's fairly crude. I put the details where they need to be. For example, I put the slits in the visor covers so that I can test it out in game and see if the visor slots need to be larger or smaller or anything to make it work in the game. So here I might tweak a bit with what the authentic is. For example, if the visor slot is too narrow and you can't see anything in the game, then I'll make it a bit wider than it naturally would be. So I put the details where they are most needed, and the rest is very crude and blocked out. So you can see here I do have some interior of the model that I sketch out. It's a bit hard to navigate in this view. But yeah, here you can see the sort of amount of details I go for in my design mesh. When I'm happy with the design mesh and it works in game, it is functional in game, then I send the model off to our outsourcing company in India, and they will start doing a high poly detailed model of the vehicle based on the design mesh and the parameters I've made for it. They might see some shapes that I might have gotten wrong, and then they'll ask me about it. Hey, our interpretation of the reference pictures is that this is a sort of different shape. What do you say about that? And in that way, we have more eyes catching small details. There might also be some details that I have intentionally made different from real life because it is needed in-game. For example, the visor slots is a good example. When our outsourcing company then has made their high poly model, then they'll send it to me, and I'll go through it, verify that everything is okay. When I give them the green light for that, then they'll do the game mesh, which is a lower poly version of the mesh, which also fits around the high poly mesh and is the mesh you actually see in the game. Then they bake the details from the high poly model onto the game mesh, so all the details they made in the high poly model with the nice smooth curves, bolts, even scratches on surfaces, they will be transferred to the game mesh as information for how the mesh is supposed to receive lighting. So you can get a lot of details on a relatively low poly mesh by baking the details from a high poly. Once I approve the game mesh, then they will start doing the texture work. And once I approve that, then they'll start doing the level of detail mesh, which is the one that is viewed from far, far away. When you are not close to the vehicle, then you don't need as many details. So we cut to an even lower poly version of the mesh, where it doesn't really have any details because it's only a couple of pixels wide. Once that is has been received and everything is approved, then we start doing more technical stuff for it, like setting up the hitboxes, making sounds, animations, finishing up some of the paint jobs, adding decals. There's the interior hitboxes that also needs to be applied. setting up the player positions so they'll move correctly, the hatches will open, and all that sort of fine polishing until it is actually ready to be released. Once we have the model in the game, then it ends up something like this. This is of course the Puma. And you might have noticed that on these new recon vehicles we have an interior modeled, which we don't have on the other tanks. This is actually consistent with all of our other recon vehicles, which all have interior modeled. And this is something we would like to have done on the tanks as well, but it is way too much work to look at the moment. But we'll keep it up for any new recon vehicles we might add. So here we have the interior. This is a part of the model you usually don't see. Some of the more keen observers of you will notice that I've added ammunition to this. This is not on live at the moment. This is something I didn't get time to do before the release, but I've made it afterwards. And it is something that will be submitted in a future minor update. No time frame on that. So about this Puma. The Puma is pretty much one of the most popular vehicles in the German army, at least for collectors and people who are enthusiastic about World War II vehicles. And the funny thing is that there are actually quite little information about it. If you are into model making, there is literally no solid concrete information about how the interior is. And this was particularly difficult to find. And I would like to express my deepest thanks to our forum user HChris, who actually got around to looking into some of our old army documents and found a US report that stated exactly the information that I could find no other places, especially around the location of ammunition inside the vehicle. I see a lot of model makers have a lot of different interpretations of where the ammunition is stored in this vehicle. Some have placed large boxes on the floor of the vehicle, and this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because when you fire the gun, it will eject a case, and eventually the whole floor will be stacked with casings, which will make it very difficult to start digging up casings, new ammunition from beneath the floor. In addition to that, there's not very a lot of room inside the vehicle, so if you're sitting on the chairs here, if you had the ammunition stored below your feet, you would be sitting with your feet all the way up to your knees, up to your chest. But HChris actually found a report from the Ordnance Technical Intelligence Report number 169, which clearly states that the provision is made for carrying 51 rounds of 5mm ammunition as followed. 7 rounds in the rack on the left side of the fighting compartment, which is the ones you see over here, and 7 in the right side in the rack of the fighting. 7 rounds in rack on the right side of the fighting compartment. In addition to that, there's 16 rounds in a bin at the left front of the fighting compartment, which is right next to the driver, and 21 rounds to the right of the driver. In addition to this, 4 rounds could be stored outside the vehicle, where I'm pointing here. Our model doesn't have this modeled, but that is where you would have additional 4 rounds. But here you have it. This would be the authentic storage arrangement of ammunition in a Puma. So like I said, there's not a whole lot of information otherwise. It was very hard to find photos of the interior of it. I found, I believe, 3 photos that shows the interior of the turret, which I've tried to model as well as I could. You have the gunner's position here. He has a periscope and a direct sight scope for the gun. There's an elevation handle, which you can see there, and a traverse handle there. The commander sits to the right. He is also the loader. He has a periscope, which is a rotating periscope, and he also loads the gun. One thing that is quite unusual about the Puma is that it's using an MG42 as its coaxial gun. Usually this is reserved for an MG34 because an MG34 is easier to change the barrel on in a tight compartment, because to change a barrel on an MG34 you twist the entire receiver, and then you can pull the barrel directly backwards. You can't do this on an MG42. Instead, you have to pull the barrel sideways and then back. The way they got around to this on the Puma is that there's a slot in the side of the turret where the gun sticks out, where the barrel will slide over to the side, and then you can pull it out. This, of course, means that there's actually a bit of a gap in the turret where you potentially would be able to have shrapnel go in or something like that. But very interesting to see an MG42 used as a coaxial gun. Of course, we have a driver down here. There's not much to say about him. He has an escape hatch over here. The steering wheel can be easily removed when you need to use the escape hatch, which in the game we are also using that as the regular enter and exit hatch because it looked quite cool. In addition to that hatch, we have two hatches here on the side. When you go through those, you end up between the wheels, which would be quite harrowing if you try to escape the vehicle while it's driving. These can also be opened from the outside using a proper tool. And there's a fourth person in the vehicle, which is the rear driver. He also operates the radio, which we have here. The rear driver is facing the rear, obviously, and will be able to steer the vehicle in reverse or forward for that matter. And this is used if you need to pull away quickly and still have an idea of where you're going. One interesting arrangement with the Puma is that it's driving just as fast backwards as it does forward, and has the same amount of reverse gears that it does forward gears. So it'll drive just as well backwards as it will forward. Another quite cool feature about the Puma is that it's four-wheel steering. Yeah, it's an eight-wheel steering arrangement. So all 8 wheels are used for turning, which gives it a fairly slow turn radius, fairly narrow turn radius. And it's obviously also an 8-wheel drive. So it's a handy little vehicle. Next up, I would like to talk a bit about the BA-11. The BA-11 is a Soviet armored car. It was produced in fairly limited numbers. Most sources states that 18 of them were built. It was actually adopted and accepted for full-on service, but due to the blockade of Leningrad, the production was halted, and that is the reason why not so many were built. Although I must say, if only 18 of these were built, there is a remarkable large amount of information available on them, and there are tons of them still existing today. I have found more pictures of the BA-11 than I have found of the Puma, despite there being so few made compared to the Puma. So this was actually my favorite vehicle to work on. Also, I think it looks very, very cool. It was used during the Battle of Leningrad It was sort of used as a tank and was remarked for being better than the T-26. It's better armored, it is more mobile, well, at least in on road, not quite as much off-road. It has a very impressive armament of, it carries 100 and something rounds. I forget the exact number, but it is absolutely stacked with ammunition. So again, we have the interior here. So I'll start with the driver's seat. Not too much to say. He sits basically on the floor. Next to him, we have the commander and the hull gunner, who has the hull gun. Actually, I did say commander. He is not the commander. I should say he's the radio operator as well. Then we have the gunner on the left side of the turret. He has one periscope and a direct vision scope. In addition to this, he also has a vision slit on his side. There's a traverse handle and an elevation handle that he controls. On the right side of the turret is the loader and commander. He loads the main gun, and he also loads the DT coaxial machine gun. This vehicle also has a rear driving position, which is this arrangement. I am not entirely sure how you would sit there if the turret is pointing forward, because as you can see, it's a tight fit to sit on the floor here if the seats are like this. He would look out through this, which is a periscope, which goes out to this exit slot. And on this vehicle, unlike the BA-10, which this one precedes, this one has the fuel tank at the rear, whereas the BA-10 had a fuel tank that was mounted in the roof above the driver. And you could probably imagine that this is not a very good place to store fuel. If it were to be punctured, then you'd be dousing the driver and the machine gunner in fuel, which they probably would not like. From the outside, you'll notice that it has these tracks. These are called overall tracks, and are used if you are to drive in some especially rough terrain. I actually were experimenting with having these mounted on the vehicle. This was while I was still in the design mesh phase of it, and to be honest, it didn't work out as well as I had hoped. So I just had them placed permanently around the rear hull, and this is also one of the things that I think makes the vehicle look so much cooler. Don't know if there's a whole lot more to say about this. This also has a lot of reverse gears and will almost go as quickly in reverse as it will moving forward. So in a lot of ways it is very similar to the Puma. It has a lot more engine power than the BA-6. I saw I had someone was commenting on the tracks. What do you want to know about the tracks? Oh, I just saw that someone were commenting on the tracks. The tracks you see here, it's basically just a wire with some metal plates riveted on. You would take each of these and apply around the rear wheels. You'll see that the rear wheels are a double set of wheels, so these vertical slits goes in between the wheels. So when you take the track, wrap it around both of the wheels, then you have a sort of a half track set up. I hope that answered that question. All right. Oh, hang on. There we go. The last of the recon vehicles was the Stuart recce. This to me was a very interesting suggestion, and I absolutely loved the idea. The Stuart recce was one of the many attempts on getting some more use out of the more or less outdated vehicles of the time. The idea is basic. You remove the turret from M5 light tank. This specific T8E1 has some wider tracks as well, which gives it even better off-road capabilities. And then you just add a 50 caliber turret ring. It handles basically the same as the Stuart. It is a bit faster because it's lighter, and it has a bit better, it actually has a lot better acceleration. And this one has the best acceleration of all the recon vehicles in the game at the moment. So it's a very nimble little fellow. It'll get you where you need to go and fast. Since it's tracked, it's also quite good at getting over obstacles, unlike the others. This was a bit too optimistic, but yeah, you get the idea that you can climb over stuff with it. Yeah, so like I said, when I had this model made, I also made sure to update the M5 Stuart model. The two models are actually using, the two vehicles are using the same models, but there are some components on it that I'm switching out to make them look as different as possible. And also the wider tracks and the mud guards on the track really helps making the two vehicles look different. When I was going through the vehicles and we were talking about this might be considered a bit underpowered since it only has a machine gun and no cannons compared to all the other recon vehicles of the same class. One of the things we did was we added the provisions for adding 2 supply crates, which I don't have mounted on this one at the moment, but you can carry 2 crates on it. And then I was looking into if it had any other features. And some of you will probably look at this and say that this looks an awful lot like a modern M113 APC. And the two are actually quite similar in size, and more importantly, they are quite similar in weight. And I know for a personal fact that the M113 is able to float, although not very well. And I was then looking into the volume and the weight of the Stuart recce and seeing, would this also be able to float? And even though I can't find any solid evidence that it was amphibious, the math I did on it is that it would actually be able to have some abilities to float, granted in favorable conditions. So we added this as a feature. And it doesn't really have any amphibious propulsions. Instead, it uses the tracks to propel it through water. This is the same way the M113 works. And I tried to capture the amphibious abilities of an M113 in this Stuart recce. So that is what this one has to offer compared to the other vehicles. And as you can see, it is not very maneuverable, but it does get you across water. It's better than sinking. I'll just make it over here. Excellent. So that was the Stuart Recce. Let's have a quick look at the old Stuart model. So here we see the two next to each other. You can really see that by just changing the track width and the mudguard, and as well as the placement of the oh, why have I just forgotten that name? The grousers, which are these things you see on the side, also here on the front. The grousers are something you can add to the tracks if you need additional traction, so getting out of thick mud or something. Then you'd remove these from the turret and attach them to the tracks instead for additional traction. By adding this to the different placements on the two models, I really changed the look of the two quite significantly, even though they are basically the same model. I also added the storage bin to the tank version of it, which is not present on the Recce version. Some of you have also noticed that since this is based on the recon vehicle, this also has interior, even though we haven't put too much attention in the turret interior. It is still there now. So this is what it looks like from the inside. So I hope you like the new vehicles and the updated Stuart model. And I think I will start doing questions now. I am starting with the questions I have received from Discord. Tatabayashi Sakurako, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, is asking, can the ranks be able to be shown on the soldier's shoulder rank? For example, the Soviet and the German, they have ranks on their shoulders. Can this be more realistic? We could actually do this. We do have a texture replacement system that would facilitate this. However, this would take quite a lot of effort into making for very small detail. It is not something I'm seeing in the near future. There are a lot of other cosmetic details that I think will have higher priority, but it's definitely a good idea. But it's not something we are going to see anytime soon. Admiral Fikes says, are there any plans to add new pistols, submachine guns and rifles? I'm not talking about just adding silenced guns, but what about adding guns like the MP28, Irma EMP and Gewehr 41, for example, for the German side? We do have some talk about new weapons being added, but none are in the foreseeable future. One of the main rifles we have been talking about for quite a long time is a Soviet SKS rifle, which would be suited for the paratroopers. There is some debate whether or not these were actually used during the war. There's not a whole lot of data that definitely says that there were. However, there is some concrete data that states that ammunition for them was delivered during the war. So something would suggest that they saw some use during the Second World War, but it is not concrete. Nonetheless, it is a rifle that we are probably gonna add sometime in the future. Then again, there is no time frame set on this, so we are still just talking about it. We have also our eyes on a couple of submachine guns, and I do know that there's a thread in the reference forum with some fairly good ideas that I tend to look at it whenever the discussion comes up again. But there's no pistols, submachine guns, or rifles on the program in the near future. As soon as we do get serious on them, they will be updated in the Trello card, and you will be seeing them in the development overview as soon as we have decided on them. Robert TDM, will there be more customizations for helmets? It would be cool to have Legion shields for Germany, Croatian, Hungarian, German, Romanian, etc. Star, hammer, and sickle for US, and White Star Ace for US, along with wires and nets. I believe there was some work done on wires and nets some time ago. I'm not entirely sure where that ended up, but helmet customization, sure, it is something we can easily add more stuff to, but it'll probably be well, I actually think that's more of a marketing question. So it is something we can definitely add at some point without too much hassle, but I don't have any tasks on my desk for them at the moment. Supermouse_R, the M5 A1 Stuart has received an interior view. Can we expect this to happen to other tanks and even planes too? I talked about this briefly before, and it's not something I'm gonna reserve for tanks, at least at the moment. Sure, new recon vehicles will be receiving them, and planes do actually have a cockpit view that is fairly detailed. So for those sort of vehicles, then we'll keep on adding interiors to those, but we won't start going through all the old tank models and add interior to them. Maybe if we are updating an old asset, we might add some sort of interior to it, but don't hold your breath. Valvados asks, can we have a 50 cal MG to the top ring of the Greyhound? It is basic weapon on that vehicle. This is also something we talked about while working on this recon update, and it landed in between two issues. One is if maybe we should add machine guns as an option for most other vehicles that can accept them. So you can choose to buy or upgrade the machine gun for example, on your Jeep. You can choose to have no machine guns, or make it 30 cal or make it a 50 cal. This is still just brainstorming talk, so no concrete answers to this yet. And another thing was that I was considering adding the machine gun to the Greyhound as well. And we sort of want to see where the new recon vehicles land compared to each other before I start changing stuff on the old ones. So if it turns out that the Greyhound is the underdog now, then we can easily add a new machine gun to it, sure. But we'll start by monitoring how it looks in the game at the moment. We have also been talking about adding the 50 cal machine guns to some of our opened tank destroyers, such as the M10 and the Jackson, the Su-76, which can also mount a rear-facing machine gun. And if we add a machine gun to the rear, then we could possibly also make it so that you can still shoot the player while he's aiming. Again, this is just brainstorming the ideas, some stuff we've been talking about, but it is certainly a possibility that we will be adding more machine guns to some of the vehicles. Mid-tier. These new recon trucks look nice. I've noticed that the Stuart tank and probably some other models got new updates recently. Will other models get updated too? And can we see current models that are being worked on, like weapons and vehicle ones? There are a few of our old assets that I would really like to see updated. It is not something we have time to do right away, but if, for example, we are doing a new vehicle that shares assets, share parts with one of our older vehicles, like I did with the Stuart, we might just do that extra 10% of work to also update the old assets. But at the moment, there are no plans on updating any of the older assets. Occasionally we do take a whack at them. For example, you have noticed that the starter rifles got a minor update a while ago. We updated them to PBR. The reason for doing this was that we wanted to do some new skins for them for a campaign. And it was not feasible to make skins with our old shading system and then convert them to the new shading system. So instead we updated the old assets to the new shading system in order to make some new skins. You will probably see this on some more weapons in the future, maybe also some vehicles where we are updating the shader and the texture of them. But we are not going to redo the models from scratch. And then the second part of the question, can we see current models that are being worked on, like weapons? Yes, I suppose I could tease some of the new machine guns we are working on. All right. So if you are looking at the development overview, you have noticed that we are making some new machine guns. I'm just cycling through them. Here's the first one. And I should stress at the moment that this is a work in progress. These models do not have any animations. They are not 100% correctly set up. And I expect them to be different. And I must apologize for the camera movement. I am currently sitting in a sofa with the mouse, so it slides around a bit. Here we go. Oop. This is the DT machine gun. This is the same machine gun that is used on pretty much all the tanks of the Soviet Union. It is the tank version of the DP machine gun. It differs in that it has a smaller radius magazine, but it's a 3-row magazine, so it has a higher magazine capacity in a more compact form. It was sometimes used in an infantry role by attaching a set of bipods and a front sight to it. And this is an assembly that was kept in all the tanks. So if you are camping with your tank, you have driven the tank into cover, and you need to set out a sentry to guard the tank, then you just take the hull gun out, attach the bipod on the side to it, and then you have an infantry machine gun. So that was very quickly the DT machine gun. Next up, and here you can definitely see that it doesn't have any animations. We have the Maxim Tokarov, which is this bad boy. And I should probably not start talking too much about the history of these guns, since I am running a bit long on time, and I could be talking for a long time if I keep that up. But yes, there we have it. And lastly is the MG13. Here I must say that this is not textured yet, so it will look rather plain. So that was a sneak peek of some future machine guns. All right, I'm going back to the questions. Unguru asks, how much would an increase to texture resolution influence the frame rate? Are you planning on doing something like that in the near future? Actually, texture resolutions doesn't really affect the frame rate all that much. But a higher texture resolution will mean that you need more video RAM in your video cards to run them. And if you don't have enough video RAM to run higher resolution, then you might get some stuttering when the game has to load some new textures into the video RAM, because you can only have as many textures as you have video RAM. So it doesn't really affect the frame rate, but it does affect stuttering if you don't have enough video RAM. The solution to higher definition graphics is actually not to increase the texture resolution, because if you double up on the texture resolution, it doesn't have a huge impact on the visual, how it looks visually. But a double in resolution means it takes up 4 times as much space in the video RAM. Instead, what is better to do is to use tiling textures, and you'll see this a lot of some of our new environment art, that these don't have one specific texture for each object. Instead, it uses more textures. It uses a texture that tiles and then grabs it and shares it between other assets. You can also see it on these new vehicles that they have detail texture, which is a tiling texture that is added on top of the main texture in order to blend out the details a bit and make it look more high-res than it actually is. I hope that answered that question. Next is General Unteroberst. Are there any plans for adding an option for manual transmission in the game? It would be a great benefit to cars and tanks trying to climb hills. This is actually sort of interesting, because our old vehicle model actually used a gear system where you would have to type in all the data of the vehicle, how many gears it had, what the gear ratio was, the torque, and a lot of stuff. And then it would automatically change the gears according to the conditions. And there was a set delay between how long a gear change would take and all that. And although it sounds like a good idea on paper, it didn't really translate into a great handling when you're playing in the game. So in our new vehicle model, we removed the transmission part of the equation and just had a permanent acceleration, which, although it's not quite as realistic, it feels a lot better when you're playing the game. So for this, there wouldn't really be any reason for manual transmissions in the game, because in the game at the moment our vehicles are essentially handling like an electric vehicle with a constant acceleration. One thing we did talk about some time ago is whether or not we should add a manual reload to the tanks. So when you fire the shot, you have to manually reload. This could be some interesting changes to the gameplay, and it would also make it easier for a tanker to change ammunition. So if you want to switch from an armor piercing to an high explosive, you can fire your armor piercing and then what was I saying? Oh yeah, fire your armor piercing, and then instead of it reloading the armor piercing, and then you can change to the high explosive, then you can fire the armor piercing and immediately change to the high explosive. And we could probably also add so you can actually reload the coaxial gun. Again, this is just something we've been talking about that would be nice to add. I hope that answered that question. Then we have E equal MC2 Trooper, or E equal Max Square. Currently, the Sonderkraft Fahrzeug 251 has no faction emblems. Will they be added one day? Oh yes, definitely. This was something that when we added the 251, it came a bit sudden. It was an old asset that we suddenly needed to update. Or when I say old asset, it is one we had made quite a while ago in our old shading system, and then we suddenly needed to update it to the new one to keep it up to code. And at that point, I didn't have a decal system quite ready for it. So it ended up being quite plain. In the meantime, we have developed a new decal system for the vehicles, which allows us to render stuff on top of the on top of the base color to do markings a lot more easier. And yes, I will definitely add some markings to the 251. I just haven't had time to do it. So I will definitely be using the decal system to do some markings on the 251. That was the questions from Discord. Before I start going over to questions from the Twitch chat, we have some announcements that I am happy to say. During this weekend, we have a community event, which we are calling Capture Denial. Basically, it goes around that the community will be gathering defense kills, and the more defense kills the entire community gets, the more discount you'll be getting on weapons repairs the entire next week. And this is, of course, a competition that everyone is in. Let me see if I have the data. It will look something like this. Here we go. Where the entire community, we are gathering around, gathering the information of how many defense kills have been made in total during the weekend. And the more defense kills have been gained, the more discount you'll be getting on weapons repair for the next week. So remember to play during the weekend and attack and defend the points. And remember, if you are charging a point and you get killed, then you're also contributing, because the guy who killed you just added 1 kill to the score. Additionally, I know that Rito Oxon has been working on some new game modes for the recons and the airplanes. Basically, we are taking the tank game mode and using it for pilots and recons as well. We are going to test this on the prototype server sometimes next week. I don't think there's a set date yet, but when it's ready, we are aiming for next week for a prototype server test on that. So I hope you'll join us on that. And let's see if we have some questions. I don't see any. Yeah, it appears that we haven't received any questions from the Twitch channel. That is sort of unusual. But I suppose that this fits the time frame of 1 hour perfectly. So yeah, I don't think I have any more to tease. I've been talking about the recon vehicles, how we put them in the game, how we decide on them, answered some questions, and we have the Capture Denial community event this weekend. Be sure to join it. And then we'll be having a prototype test sometimes next week for recon and pilot game modes. So, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in, and have a nice weekend.